Every parent knows that sound, the cry of a child whose world has just shattered into pieces. When 10-year-old Clara ran through the streets of Cedar Ridge, her desperate sobs carried the kind of pain that makes grown men stop and listen. "Daddy said sleep in the barn with pigs," she kept saying, clutching her old teddy bear. The people in town didn't know what to make of it. Sheriff Tom Avery figured it was just a family problem. He'd seen plenty of those in his 20 years keeping the peace. But when he rode out to the Hartwell ranch the next morning, what he found in that barn changed everything. Clara's father was dead, hidden among the pigs. The little girl said she didn't know how he got there. What secret was Clara really hiding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Sheriff Tom Avery buttoned his worn vest and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. 20 years of keeping the peace in this frontier town had taught him to read trouble like weather patterns, and yesterday's storm with little Clara Hartwell had left him unsettled in ways he couldn't quite name. Cedar Ridge sat nestled in a valley where the grass grew thick and the cattle grew fat, surrounded by rolling hills that turned gold in the autumn light. It was the kind of place where a man could make an honest living with his hands and his word, where neighbors knew each other's business sometimes better than their own. The town boasted a main street lined with whitewashed buildings. Murphy's General Store, the Cedar Ridge Bank with its brass nameplate, Doc Henderson's office above the barber shop, and the Silver Dollar Saloon where ranchers gathered to settle their differences over whiskey and cards. Tom had seen the town grow from a collection of hastily built shacks to a proper community, with a church, a schoolhouse, and even talk of bringing the railroad through. He'd been a young deputy then, full of fire and certainty about right and wrong. Now, at 45, his dark hair showed threads of silver, and his weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd learned that truth often wore more faces than he cared to count. The Hartwell Ranch lay 3 miles east of town, where the valley opened up toward distant mountains that caught the morning light like purple glass. As Tom rode his bay gelding along the dusty road, he found himself thinking about Clara's desperate words from the night before. In 2 decades of law enforcement, he'd heard children say plenty of strange things when they were scared or confused. But something about her voice, that raw, broken quality, had kept him awake most of the night. Jed Hartwell had been what folks in these parts called a good neighbor. Quiet, hard-working, the kind of man who'd lend you tools without asking when you'd return them, and who showed up when barn raisings or brandings needed extra hands. His wife Sarah had died 2 winters back from the consumption, leaving him to raise Clara on his own. Tom remembered how the whole town had turned out for Sarah's funeral, how Jed had stood there beside that small grave with Clara pressed against his legs, both of them looking like they'd lost their anchor in a storm. After that, people noticed changes in both of them. Jed became more withdrawn, declining invitations to church socials and town meetings. Clara, who'd once been a bright, chattering little thing, grew quiet and serious, rarely seen without the handmade teddy bear her mother had sewn for her. The bear showed its age now, faded brown fabric, one button eye replaced with a mismatched black one, stuffing that had shifted and settled over countless nights of holding. As Tom approached the Hartwell property, he could see the barn in question, a sturdy structure built from local timber, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood in the morning light. The pig pen attached to the side held a dozen or so Hampshire hogs, their black and white bodies moving lazily in the cool air. Nothing about the scene suggested violence or tragedy, yet Tom's instincts, honed by years of experience, told him to pay attention to details that might not seem important at first glance. He dismounted near the house, a modest 2-story structure, with a covered porch where Clara often sat with her bear, watching the world go by. The morning was still, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft grunting of pigs. Tom tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the barn with the careful steps of a man who'd learned that crime scenes could tell stories if you knew how to listen. The barn doors stood slightly ajar, and Tom pulled them open slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The smell hit him first, not just the usual odors of hay and animals, but something else, something that made his stomach tighten with recognition. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of straw and empty feed sacks, lay the body of Jed Hartwell. Tom knelt beside the corpse, his trained eye taking in details that would matter later. Jed's clothes were torn, his knuckles scraped and bloody, signs of a fight. His face bore bruises that suggested he'd given as good as he'd gotten before whatever happened ended his life. Most telling of all, his body had been deliberately concealed, covered with materials meant to hide it from casual view. Standing slowly, Tom surveyed the rest of the barn. Overturned buckets, scattered hay, a pitchfork lying at an odd angle against the wall, all evidence of a struggle that had ended with a man's death. But why had Clara said her daddy told her to sleep with the pigs? Had she witnessed something that night, something too terrible for a 10-year-old mind to process clearly? The sheriff's methodical search of the barn revealed more questions than answers. In a corner near where Jed's body lay hidden, Tom discovered a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Jed's careful handwriting. The most recent entries spoke of worries about money, about pressure from someone wanting to buy his land, about fears for Clara's safety if something should happen to him. One entry, dated just 3 days before, caught Tom's attention. M.W. came by again today, made another offer, said it was his final one, told him the same as before, this land stays in the family. He didn't take it well. The way he looked at Clara when he left has me worried. A man desperate for land might do desperate things. M.W. Tom knew those initials belonged to Marcus Wade, the most successful rancher in 3 counties. Wade owned vast stretches of prime grazing land, employed dozens of cowboys, and carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. The idea that he might resort to violence seemed far-fetched, but Tom had learned never to dismiss possibilities too quickly. The journal revealed other concerns as well. Jed wrote about strange sounds at night, about feeling watched when he worked his fields, about Clara's increasing nightmares and her claims that bad men were coming. Reading these entries, Tom began to understand that whatever had happened, it might have been building for weeks or even months. As he carefully wrapped the journal in his coat and prepared to leave the barn, Tom heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the open doors, he saw 3 riders approaching. Marcus Wade himself, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. Wade was a big man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. His companions were younger, harder-looking men with the weathered faces and steady hands of professional cowboys. "Morning, Sheriff," Wade called out as he dismounted. "Heard there was some trouble out here last night. Thought we'd ride over and see if we could help." Tom stepped out of the barn, noting how Wade's eyes immediately went to the building behind him. "Trouble would be putting it mildly, Marcus. Jed Hartwell's been murdered." Wade's reaction seemed genuine. A sharp intake of breath, a step backward, a hand raised to his chest. "Murdered? Good Lord, Sheriff, when, how?" "Working on those details," Tom replied, watching Wade's face carefully. "The little girl ran into town last night, saying something about her daddy telling her to sleep in the barn with pigs. Found Jed's body this morning hidden under some sacks." "Clara?" Wade's voice caught. "Is she all right? That poor child's been through enough already." Tom found Wade's concern touching, but he'd learned to separate emotion from evidence. "She's safe, staying with the widow Morrison for now. Marcus, I need to ask, when was the last time you spoke with Jed?" Wade glanced at his men, then back at Tom. "Few days ago, I suppose, maybe a week. We've had our differences about land deals, but nothing that would lead to—" He gestured helplessly toward the barn. "Sheriff, if you think I had anything to do with this—" "I don't think anything yet," Tom interrupted. Just gathering facts. Those differences you mentioned. Anything recent that might have caused bad blood?" Wade was quiet for a long moment, and Tom could see him weighing his words. "Jed was having money troubles, Sheriff. Bank was pressuring him about his loan. I made him a fair offer for his land. More than fair, actually. He turned me down, said the place had too many memories." That matched what Tom had read in the journal, but it also provided Marcus Wade with a motive for murder. A man who wanted land badly enough might kill for it, especially if he thought he could make it look like an accident or robbery gone wrong. "I'll need to know where you were last night," Tom said quietly. Wade straightened in his saddle. "At home. With my family, Sheriff. My wife and daughter can vouch for that, as can my household staff." "Good to know," Tom replied. "I'll likely want to speak with them in the next day or two." As Wade and his men prepared to leave, Tom noticed something glinting in the dirt near the pig pen. A small object caught the morning sunlight, something that didn't belong in a barnyard. He made a mental note to examine it more closely after the visitors departed. The sound of hoofbeats announced another arrival. This time it was Doc Henderson, a spare man in his 60s who served as the town's physician and coroner when needed. Behind him rode Clara's aunt, Margaret Hartwell, a woman in her 40s who'd traveled from the county seat after receiving word of her brother-in-law's death. "Tom," Doc Henderson nodded grimly as he dismounted, "heard we've got ourselves a situation." Margaret Hartwell looked older than her years, her face drawn with grief and worry. "Sheriff, how is Clara? Can I see her?" "She's staying with Widow Morrison right now," Tom assured her. "You can collect her any time. She's going to need family around her." As Doc Henderson began his examination of the body, Tom walked Margaret toward the house, giving her time to absorb the reality of the situation. She'd traveled hard to get here, and the shock of her brother-in-law's death was clearly taking its toll. "Jed was a good man," she said quietly. "After Sarah died, I kept asking him to send Clara to live with me for a while, just until he got back on his feet. He wouldn't hear of it. Said they needed each other." Tom thought about the journal entries, about Jed's fears and worries. "Had he mentioned any troubles to you? Money problems, disputes with neighbors?" Margaret shook her head. "He never complained about anything. But in his letters, I could tell he was struggling. The ranch was too much for one man to handle, especially with a young child to care for." Doc Henderson emerged from the barn, his expression grave. "Sheriff, I'll need to examine the body more thoroughly back in town, but I can tell you this. Jed Hartwell died from blunt force trauma to the head. Looks like he fought hard before he went down." The morning sun climbed higher as Tom continued his investigation, but each new piece of evidence seemed to complicate rather than clarify the picture. A man was dead. A little girl was traumatized, and somewhere in the growing web of motives and opportunities lay the truth about what had happened in this quiet barn on a night when darkness had brought more than sleep to the Hartwell ranch. As he prepared to return to town with Doc Henderson and Margaret Hartwell, Tom glanced back at the barn one more time. Somewhere in Clara's fractured words lay the key to solving this mystery. He just had to figure out how to help a frightened child find her voice again, because right now she might be the only person who truly knew what had happened to her father. In those final, terrible moments, the formal investigation began at dawn the next day, when Tom returned to the Hartwell ranch with his deputy, a young man named Billy Watson, whose eagerness sometimes outweighed his experience. The morning air carried the promise of autumn, crisp and clean, but Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "What are we looking for exactly, Sheriff?" Billy asked as they approached the barn. "Anything that doesn't belong," Tom replied, dismounting near the pig pen. "Sometimes the smallest detail can crack a case wide open." The crime scene looked different in the clear morning light. Tom could see scuff marks in the dirt that he'd missed the day before, signs of a struggle that had spilled out from the barn into the yard. Near the water trough, he found what had caught his eye yesterday, a silver pocket watch, its chain broken, lying half buried in the mud. Tom picked up the timepiece carefully. wiping away the dirt with his handkerchief. On the back, engraved, in flowing script, were the initials M.W. and a date from 15 years earlier. His stomach tightened as he recognized the significance of this find. "Billy, bag this up careful-like," he said, handing over the watch. "And don't mention it to anyone just yet." Inside the barn, Doc Henderson had finished his preliminary examination of Jed's body. The physician's face was grim as he approached. "Tom with his findings. 3 distinct blows to the head," Doc reported quietly. "First one might not have been fatal, but the killer didn't stop there. Jed fought back hard. His knuckles are torn up, and there's skin under his fingernails. Whoever did this didn't walk away unmarked." Tom absorbed this information while examining the scene more closely. The hay was scattered in patterns that suggested a prolonged fight, not a quick, brutal attack. Jed Hartwell had been a strong man, and he'd clearly given his killer a real battle. "Time of death?" Tom asked. "Hard to say exactly, but sometime. Between 9 and midnight 3 nights ago. The cool weather in the barn makes it difficult to be more precise. 3 nights ago, that would put the murder on the same evening Clara had run screaming through town." Tom wondered what the little girl had been doing during those crucial hours, and more importantly, what she might have seen. The discovery of the threatening note came when Billy was searching through Jed's jacket pockets. The paper was folded, small and tucked deep in the inside pocket, as if Jed had been carrying it around for some time. The message was brief and written in block letters. "Sell now or face the consequences. This is your final warning." Tom studied the note carefully. The paper was expensive, the kind used for business correspondence, and the writing showed education and careful formation of letters. This wasn't the work of a common drifter or ranch hand. "Sheriff," Billy called from near the barn door, "you might want to see this." Tom followed his deputy to where a piece of dark fabric was caught on a splinter of wood about 6 feet up on the doorframe. The material was fine wool, expensive, the kind worn by successful businessmen rather than working ranchers. "Looks like our killer snagged his coat trying to get out fast," Billy observed. "Or trying to get in quiet," Tom corrected. "Bag this too." As they continued their examination, Tom became increasingly aware that this wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. Someone had planned this carefully, had known Jed's routines, had waited for the right moment to strike. The killer had also been confident enough to spend time hiding the body, which suggested either exceptional nerve or familiarity with the property. The sound of an approaching buggy interrupted their work. Tom looked up to see Margaret Hartwell arriving with Clara, who sat beside her aunt like a small, fragile bird. The child clutched her teddy bear tightly, her dark eyes wide and fearful as she stared at the barn where her father had died. "Clara." "Honey," Tom said gently, approaching the buggy. "I know this is hard, but I need to ask you some questions about that night." Clara's grip on her bear tightened, and she pressed closer to her aunt. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daddy said sleep in the barn with pigs." "I know, sweetheart. Can you tell me more about that?" "Did your daddy really say those words to you?" Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the barn. "Not Daddy. The bad man. The bad man said Daddy said it." Tom felt his pulse quicken. This was the first time Clara had mentioned anyone else being present that night. "Clara, can you tell me about the bad man? What did he look like?" But the little girl had retreated into silence again, turning her face into her aunt's shoulder. Margaret stroked Clara's hair gently. "She's been having terrible nightmares," Margaret whispered. "Wakes up screaming about bad men and pigs. Sometimes she talks in her sleep, but it's mostly nonsense." Tom made a mental note to speak with Margaret privately about what Clara might have said in her sleep. Children often revealed more truth in their dreams than in their waking hours, especially when they'd witnessed something traumatic. "We should get her away from here," Doc Henderson said quietly. "This can't be good for her state of mind." But as Margaret prepared to drive Clara back to town, the little girl suddenly spoke up again, her voice clearer than it had been since the tragedy. "Daddy fought the bad man. Daddy was brave. Tom knelt down beside the buggy, bringing himself to Clara's eye level. "Yes, honey, your daddy was very brave. Did you see the bad man hurt your daddy?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Slowly. "Daddy told me to hide. I hid with the pigs. The bad man looked for me, but the pigs kept me safe." This revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. Clara hadn't just discovered her father's body. She'd witnessed his murder. The trauma of watching her father die explained her strange behavior, her cryptic words, her retreat into silence. "Clara, this is very important," Tom said as gently as he could. "Can you tell me anything about what the bad man looked like? Was he tall or short? Young or old?" Clara studied her teddy bear's worn face for a long moment before answering. "He had shiny buttons, and he smelled like Daddy's medicine." Shiny buttons suggested a well-dressed man, someone who wore a vest or coat with metal fasteners. The reference to her father's medicine was puzzling until Tom remembered that Jed had occasionally used liniment for his back, a strong-smelling concoction that contained alcohol and various herbs. "Did the bad man say anything to your daddy?" "He was angry about the land. He said Daddy was being stupid." Clara's voice grew smaller. "Then they fought and Daddy fell down." Tom felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture. The killer had come to pressure Jed about selling his land. The confrontation had escalated into violence, and Clara had witnessed it all while hiding somewhere in or near the barn. "One more question, honey. After your daddy fell down, what did the bad man do?" Clara was quiet for so long that Tom thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice barely audible above the morning breeze, she whispered, "He covered Daddy up with the hay. Then he looked for me, but I was hiding good. When he went away, I ran to town." Margaret wrapped her arms more tightly around Clara, tears streaming down her own face. "Oh, sweetheart, you were so brave." As the buggy carrying Clara and her aunt disappeared down the dusty road toward town, Tom stood in the barnyard weighing what he'd learned. A well-dressed man with shiny buttons had confronted Jed about his land, killed him when the conversation turned violent, and then spent time concealing the body. Clara had witnessed it all from a hiding place that kept her safe but traumatized. The pocket watch with Marcus Wade's initials, the expensive fabric caught on the barn door, the threatening note, all the evidence seemed to point toward the wealthy rancher. But Tom had learned to be cautious about cases that seemed too straightforward. Sometimes the obvious answer was correct, but sometimes it was exactly what a clever killer wanted you to think. "What's our next move, Sheriff?" Billy asked, as they prepared to leave the ranch. Tom looked back at the barn one more time, thinking about a frightened little girl hiding among the pigs while her father fought for his life. "We're going to pay a visit to Marcus Wade. And Billy, bring your gun." The Wade Ranch sprawled across some of the finest grazing land in the territory, a testament to 3 generations of shrewd business deals and careful stewardship. The main house sat on a rise overlooking miles of rolling pasture, a 2-story structure built from imported timber and local stone that spoke of wealth earned and properly invested. Tom and Billy rode up the long drive between whitewashed fence and posts passing herds of prime cattle that would bring top dollar at market. Everything about the place suggested prosperity and permanence, from the well-maintained outbuildings to the manicured gardens that surrounded the main house. Marcus Wade met them on the front porch, his manner cordial but cautious. He was dressed in a fine wool suit despite the early hour, his silver hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a high shine. Tom noted the expensive vest with its row of silver buttons. Buttons that could easily be described as shiny by "Oh, frightened child." "Sheriff, deputy," Wade nodded formally. "I assume this visit is about poor Jed Hartwell. Please come inside. My wife has coffee on." The interior of the Wade house reflected the same attention to quality as the exterior. Rich carpets covered polished hardwood floors, and the furniture was the kind that lasted for generations. Tom accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Wade, a dignified woman who expressed genuine sorrow about Jed's death, before excusing herself to give the men privacy. "Marcus," Tom began carefully, I need to ask you some direct questions about your relationship with Jed Hartwell." Wade settled into a leather chair beside the fireplace, his hand steady as he sipped his coffee. "Of course, Sheriff. I want to help however I can. You mentioned you'd made offers to buy his land. How many times did you approach him about this?" "3 times over the past 6 months," Wade replied without hesitation. "The first was just after the spring roundup. Jed was clearly struggling financially, and I thought a fair offer might help him and Clara start fresh somewhere else. And the other times," Wade's expression grew more serious. "The second was in July, after I heard the bank was pressuring him about his loan. The third was last week, when I learned his situation had become truly desperate." Tom pulled the threatening note from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Marcus, have you ever seen this before?" Wade picked up the note and read it carefully, his face showing what appeared to be genuine surprise. "No, Sheriff, I haven't, but I can tell you this isn't my handwriting, and it certainly doesn't reflect my approach to business dealings." "Your approach being what exactly?" "Fair offers, honest negotiations, and respect for a man's right to say no." Wade set the note down firmly. "Sheriff, I've been successful in this business for 25 years without resorting to threats or violence. Why would I start now?" Billy spoke up for the first time. "Because maybe this time the answer was no once too often?" Wade's eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. "Deputy, I'm a patient man. If Jed Hartwell had said no to me a dozen times, I would have respected his decision and moved on to other opportunities." Tom reached into his other pocket and produced the silver watch. Wade's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale, and his hand moved instinctively to his vest pocket. "Recognize this, Marcus? Where did you find it?" Wade's composure was cracking for the first time since they'd arrived in the mud near Jed's pig pen. "Want to explain how it got there?" Wade stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking his pastures. When he turned back, his expression was troubled, but not defensive. "Sheriff, that watch was a gift from my father when I turned 21. I've carried it every day for 25 years. He pulled an identical timepiece from his vest pocket. "This is my everyday watch. The one you found, I thought I'd lost it months ago." Tom examined the second watch carefully. It was indeed identical to the first, down to the inscription on the back, though this one showed the wear of daily use. "When do you think you lost it?" "I'm not certain. I noticed it was missing sometime in late spring, but I couldn't remember when I'd last seen it. I assumed it had fallen out of my pocket while I was working cattle, or while you were visiting Jed Hartwell." Wade met Tom's gaze steadily. "Sheriff, I haven't been on Jed's property in over a year. The last time we spoke, it was here, in this house, when he came to tell me he wouldn't consider selling under any circumstances." Tom felt the case becoming more complicated rather than clearer. The evidence still pointed toward Wade, but the man's reactions seemed genuine. Either he was an exceptional liar, or someone else was deliberately trying to implicate him in Jed's murder. "Marcus, I need to know where you were 3 nights ago between 9 and midnight. At home with my family. We had dinner together. Then Mary and I played cards with our daughter until about 10. After that we went to bed." Wade's voice was steady. "You're welcome to speak with them." "I will," Tom assured him. "But first, I want to hear about anyone else who might have wanted Jed's land, or had a grudge against him." Wade returned to his chair, seeming to consider the question carefully. "Sheriff, Jed was a quiet man who kept to himself. I can't think of anyone who disliked him personally. As for his land, it's good property, but nothing so special that it would drive a man to murder." "What about your foreman, Samuel Cross? Billy mentioned he has a reputation for settling disputes with his fists." "Sam's been with me for 8 years. Wade said firmly. "He's hard when he needs to be, but he's not a killer. Besides, he was with a crew moving cattle to the north pasture that entire week." Tom made notes in his pocket journal, but something was bothering him about the whole situation. The evidence against Wade was substantial. The watch, his admitted interest in Jed's land, his financial resources that could have motivated desperate action. Yet the man's demeanor suggested innocence, and his explanations, while convenient, had the ring of truth. One more thing, Marcus. Clara mentioned that her father's killer smelled like medicine. Jed used liniment for his back. Do you know anything about that? Wade nodded. Doc Henderson recommended it for anyone doing heavy ranch work. I use it myself sometimes, as does half the county. He paused thoughtfully. Sheriff, if someone wanted to frame me for this murder, they couldn't have chosen better evidence. My watch, my known interest in the property, even a smell that half the ranchers in the territory share. That possibility had been growing in Tom's mind as well. The evidence against Wade was almost too perfect, too convenient. But if someone was trying to frame the wealthy rancher, who would have both the motive and the knowledge to do so effectively? As Tom and Billy prepared to leave, Wade walked them to their horses. Sheriff, I understand why I'm a suspect, and I don't blame you for investigating thoroughly, but while you're focusing on me, the real killer is walking free. Find him before he decides Clara knows too much about what she saw that night. The warning sent a chill down Tom's spine. If Wade was innocent, then Clara was indeed in danger from whoever had killed her father. And if Wade was guilty, his apparent concern for the child could be an act designed to deflect suspicion. Either way, Tom realized he needed to ensure Clara's safety while he continued his investigation. The little girl had already lost her father. He wasn't going to let her become the killer's next victim. The investigation expanded beyond Marcus Wade, as Tom realized the evidence might be pointing him toward a carefully constructed deception. Back in town, he began methodically examining other residents who might have had motive or opportunity. To kill Jed Hartwell, Samuel Cross proved to be exactly what Wade had described, a hard man with a reputation for settling disputes with his fists, but not a murderer. Tom found him at the Silver Dollar Saloon, nursing a whiskey and showing fresh bruises on his knuckles that he claimed came from breaking up a fight between two ranch hands. Jed Hartwell was a decent man, Cross said when Tom questioned him. Kept to himself, minded his own business. Can't think of anyone who'd want to hurt him. What about his land? Anyone else interested in buying it? Cross shrugged. Land's always valuable, Sheriff, but there's plenty to go around if a man's willing to work for it. Killing for it seems like more trouble than it's worth. Tom examined Cross's hands carefully. The bruises were fresh, but consistent with the story about breaking up a fight. More importantly, Doc Henderson had found skin under Jed's fingernails, and Cross showed no scratches or defensive wounds. The torn fabric found at the crime scene led Tom to visit Mrs. Patterson, the town's seamstress, and the person most likely to recognize expensive material. The elderly woman examined the cloth through her magnifying glass, turning it over in her weathered hands. This is fine wool, Sheriff, the kind they make into gentlemen's coats back east. Costs more than most folks in Cedar Ridge make in a month. She held it up to the light. See how tight the weave is? This came from someone with real money. Anyone in town wear coats like this? Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment. Marcus Wade has a coat made from similar material. I've mended it for him twice, but so does Thomas Millfield at the bank, and that traveling salesman who comes through every few months. Thomas Millfield. Tom made a mental note to speak with the banker. In a town where most financial troubles eventually ended up at the bank, Millfield would know better than anyone about Jed's monetary situation. That evening, Tom returned to the widow Morrison's house to check on Clara. Margaret Hartwell had decided to stay in town for a few more days to help Clara adjust, and the two of them were sitting on the front porch when Tom arrived. Clara looked up when she saw him approaching, her dark eyes still holding the wariness of a frightened animal. But something in her expression had changed. The blankness was giving way to a sharp intelligence that reminded Tom of her mother. "Hello, Clara," Tom said gently, settling into a chair across from her. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she said quietly, clutching her teddy bear. "Aunt Margaret says I can come live with her." That sounds nice. You'll like that, won't you? Clara nodded, but then her expression grew serious. Sheriff, will you catch the bad man who hurt Daddy? I'm going to do everything I can, Tom promised. Clara, I know this is hard to talk about, but can you remember anything else about that night? Anything that might help me find the bad man? Clara was quiet for a long moment, stroking her bear's worn fur. When she spoke, her voice was steady but sad. The bad man was looking for something. After Daddy fell down, he went through Daddy's pockets. Then he went in the house. This was new information. Did you see what he was looking for? Papers. I think he was mad when he couldn't find them. Tom thought about Jed's journal, which had been hidden in the barn rather than kept in the house. Had the killer been looking for something specific, perhaps evidence of their previous confrontations or threats? Clara, you said the bad man had shiny buttons. Can you remember anything else about what he looked like? His hair, his face? Clara closed her eyes, and Tom could see her struggling with memories that caused her pain. He was tall. Not as tall as Daddy, but taller than you. And he walked funny. Walked funny how? Like his leg hurt. Like when Daddy hurt his back and couldn't walk straight. A limp. That was a detail that could prove crucial in identifying the killer. Tom made a mental note to pay attention to how various suspects moved. One more question, sweetheart. When you were hiding, could you hear what the bad man and your daddy were saying to each other? Clara's grip tightened on her bear. The bad man said Daddy was being stupid about the papers. Daddy said he'd never give them up, that they were Clara's future. Then they started fighting. Papers that represented Clara's future. Tom wondered if this referred to something more than just the land deed. Could there be other documents, perhaps, related to Clara's inheritance or her mother's family, that someone wanted desperately enough to kill for? As Tom prepared to leave, Clara called out to him, "Sheriff, the bad man dropped something when he was running away. I saw it from where I was hiding." Tom's pulse quickened. What did he drop, Clara? Something that made a noise when it hit the ground, like when Daddy drops his keys. Where did it land? Clara pointed toward the barn. By the water trough, where the pigs drink. The pocket watch. Clara had actually seen Marcus Wade's watch fall from the killer's pocket. But this raised more questions than it answered. If Wade had been the killer, why would he drop his own watch? And if someone else was the killer, how had they come to possess Wade's timepiece? That night, Tom sat in his office going over every piece of evidence. The threatening note, the expensive fabric, the watch, Clara's testimony about a tall man with a limp who smelled like liniment. Each clue seemed to point in a different direction. Billy knocked on the door and entered with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about what Clara said about the killer looking for papers in the house." "What about it?" "Well, if he was looking for something specific, maybe he found it. Or maybe he didn't find it because it's still hidden somewhere." "We haven't looked." Tom leaned back in his chair. Billy might be young, but he had good instincts. "You think we should search the house again?" "I think we should search everywhere again. And Sheriff, I think we should post someone to watch Clara. If the killer didn't find what he was looking for, he might come back for it. And if Clara saw more than she's told us," Tom finished the thought, "then she's in danger." The realization that Clara might still be at risk from her father's killer added urgency to the investigation. Tom decided that first thing in the morning, he would conduct a thorough search of the Hartwell property, looking for whatever papers the killer had wanted badly enough to commit murder. But as he locked up his office and headed home, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, some crucial detail that would tie all the evidence together and point him toward the truth. The killer had been clever enough to plan the murder carefully and frame Marcus Wade effectively. Such a person wouldn't leave loose ends untied for long. Time was running out, and somewhere in Cedar Ridge, a murderer was walking free, perhaps planning his next move to ensure his crime stayed hidden forever. The discovery came when Margaret was mending Clara's beloved teddy bear. The child had been carrying the worn toy everywhere, and constant handling had loosened some of the seams that her mother had sewn years earlier. as Margaret carefully opened the bear's back to restuff it with fresh cotton. Her fingers encountered something unexpected, a small piece of paper, carefully folded and sewn into the bear's interior. "Clara, honey," Margaret called gently. "Come here for a moment." Clara approached hesitantly, worry creasing her young face when she saw her bear opened up on the kitchen table. "Is he going to be okay?" "He'll be fine, sweetheart. But look what I found inside him." Margaret carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a letter written in Sarah Hartwell's delicate handwriting. The letter was addressed to Clara, with instructions that it should be given to her when she turned 18. But the circumstances of recent events seemed to warrant reading it now. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the contents, her face growing pale with each line. "What does it say?" Clara asked, sensing her aunt's distress. Margaret looked at the little girl, seeing her with new eyes. "Clara, this letter is from your mama. It says that Jed wasn't your real father." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. According to Sarah's letter, Clara's biological father was a wealthy businessman named Charles Whitmore, who had abandoned Sarah when he learned she was pregnant. Sarah had fled east and eventually met Jed Hartwell, who had married her and agreed to raise Clara as his own daughter. But the letter contained even more startling information. Charles Whitmore had died the previous year, leaving behind a substantial inheritance that legally belonged to Clara. Sarah had hidden the documents proving Clara's parentage and inheritance rights, fearing that someday Whitmore's family might try to claim the money by eliminating Clara. Margaret's hands shook as she finished reading. "Clara, according to this letter, you're entitled to a very large sum of money when you turn 18. Your mother hid the legal papers that prove it, and she made Jed promise to protect you until you came of age." Clara listened with the solemn attention of a child trying to understand adult complications. "Is that why the bad man killed Daddy? Because of the papers?" Margaret realized that the murder might not have been about Jed's ranch at all. Someone who knew about Clara's inheritance might have killed Jed to gain control of the child and, by extension, her money. A legal guardian would have significant influence over such a fortune, especially if Clara were to die before reaching adulthood. "Clara," Margaret said carefully, "did your daddy ever talk to you about your real father, or about money that might be yours someday?" Clara shook her head. "Daddy said Mama left me something special, but he never told me what it was. He said I'd understand when I was older." The letter also revealed why Jed had been so determined to keep his land. It wasn't just about memories or stubborn pride. Sarah had hidden the inheritance documents somewhere on the property, and Jed knew that selling the ranch might mean losing the only proof of Clara's legal rights. Margaret immediately sent for Sheriff Avery, who arrived within the hour. Tom read Sarah's letter twice, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "This changes everything," he said finally. "We're not looking at a simple land dispute anymore. We're looking at someone who wants control of a child's inheritance." "How much money are we talking about?" Margaret asked. Tom studied the letter again. "According to this, Charles Whitmore was involved in railroad construction and mining operations. His estate could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more." Clara sat quietly through this discussion, still processing the news that the man she'd known as her father wasn't her biological parent. But Tom could see the intelligence in her young eyes, the understanding that this information somehow connected to her father's death. "Clara," Tom said gently, "do you remember your daddy ever showing you special hiding places around the ranch? Places where he might keep important papers?" Clara thought for a moment. "Daddy had a secret place in the barn, under the loose board where he kept his extra money, and Mama used to hide things in the chimney upstairs." Tom felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. If the killer had known about Clara's inheritance, he might have murdered Jed specifically to gain access to the documents that proved her claim. But who in Cedar Ridge would have known about Charles Whitmore and his connection to the Hartwell family? Margaret, I need you and Clara to stay in town where I can keep an eye on you. If someone killed Jed for those documents, they might not stop there. The sheriff's next stop was the Cedar Ridge Bank, where Thomas Millfield served as president and handled most of the town's financial affairs. Millfield was a precise man in his 50s, always impeccably dressed and known for his attention to detail. If anyone in town might have knowledge of large inheritances or legal documents, it would be him. Tom found Millfield in his office, reviewing loan applications with his characteristic thoroughness. The banker looked up when Tom entered, his expression polite but cautious. "Sheriff Avery, what can I do for you today?" "Thomas, I need to ask you about Jed Hartwell's financial situation, specifically whether you knew anything about his wife's family or any potential inheritance involving Clara." Millfield's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed and his hands gripped the edge of his desk. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Sheriff." Tom studied the banker's face carefully. "Jed was killed by someone looking for documents related to Clara's inheritance from her biological father. I'm wondering if you might have had any knowledge of such matters." "Sheriff, I handle confidential financial information for many families in this town. I can't discuss the details of anyone's personal affairs." But Tom noticed that Millfield's usual precise speech was faltering, and perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the office. "Thomas, this is a murder investigation. If you know something that might help me catch Jed's killer, you have an obligation to share it." Millfield stood abruptly and walked to the window, overlooking the main street. When he turned back, his expression was troubled. "Sheriff, about 3 months ago I received inquiries from a law firm back east. They were trying to locate the heirs of Charles Whitmore, who had died without a proper will. The lawyers had traced Whitmore's connection to a woman named Sarah, and they believed she might have had a child." Tom felt his pulse quicken. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I didn't know anything about such matters." "But, Sheriff," Millfield's voice dropped to a whisper, "I lied. I'd seen Sarah's marriage certificate when she and Jed applied for their loan. It listed her maiden name as Sarah Whitmore." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Tom realized that Millfield had known about Clara's potential inheritance for months, but had kept the information secret. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I knew what it would mean for that little girl. Once word got out about her inheritance, every greedy person within 100 miles would have schemes to get their hands on it. I thought it was better left buried." But someone else had clearly known about the inheritance, someone willing to kill for it. Tom wondered if Millfield himself might have been tempted by such a fortune, or if he had inadvertently revealed the information to the wrong person. As Tom prepared to leave the bank, he noticed something that made him pause. Millfield walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg in a way that matched Clara's description of her father's killer. And the banker's expensive wool coat hung on a peg behind his desk, a coat that could easily have provided the fabric. Found at the crime scene, the investigation was taking a new and dangerous turn, and Tom realized that Clara's inheritance had painted a target on her back that wouldn't disappear until her father's killer was brought to justice. The search of the Hartwell property took on new urgency, as Tom realized they were looking for documents worth more than anyone in Cedar Ridge had imagined. With Billy's help, he began a systematic examination of every possible hiding place Jed might have used to conceal Clara's inheritance papers. The loose board in the barn that Clara had mentioned yielded only a small cache of silver coins, Jed's emergency fund that had probably saved the family from complete destitution in recent months. But the chimney in the upstairs bedroom proved more promising. Tom found the documents wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind a loose brick about 6 feet up the chimney, high enough that Clara couldn't have reached them, but accessible to an adult who knew where to look. The papers confirmed everything Sarah's letter had revealed. Clara's birth certificate listing Charles Whitmore as her father, legal documents establishing her claim to his estate, and correspondence from Eastern lawyers trying to locate Whitmore's heirs. "This is a fortune, Sheriff," Billy said, examining the inheritance papers. "More money than this whole town sees in a year." The documents also revealed something else crucial. Someone had already been in contact with the Eastern lawyers. A letter dated just 2 weeks before Jed's murder showed that Thomas Millfield had written to the law firm, claiming to represent Clara's interests and requesting detailed information about the inheritance process. Tom's blood ran cold as he read Millfield's letter. The banker had positioned himself as Clara's unofficial guardian and financial advisor, despite having no legal right to do so. More disturbing still, the letter suggested that Clara's legal guardianship could be transferred to someone better equipped to manage such substantial assets. "Billy, we need to get back to town immediately," Tom said, folding the documents carefully, "and we need to make sure Clara stays safe." But as they prepared to leave the ranch, Tom noticed fresh horse tracks in the dirt near the house. Tracks that hadn't been there during their morning search. Someone had visited the property while they were investigating, someone who might have been watching and waiting for them to leave. The ride back to Cedar Ridge felt longer than usual, every shadow potentially hiding a threat. Tom's mind raced through the implications of what they'd discovered. If Millfield was willing to forge legal documents to gain control of Clara's inheritance, murder wouldn't be beyond his capabilities. They found the town unusually quiet for late afternoon, with fewer people than normal on the main street. Tom's unease grew as they approached the Widow Morrison's house, where Clara and Margaret were supposed to be staying safely. Widow Morrison met them at the door, her face etched with worry. "Sheriff, thank goodness you're back. That banker, Mr. Millfield, came by about an hour ago with some legal papers. Said he needed to speak with Clara about her father's estate." Tom's heart sank. "Where are they now?" He took them to his office at the bank. "Said it was official business that couldn't wait." Tom and Billy exchanged grim looks. Millfield had made his move while they were conveniently away from town, and now he had Clara and Margaret in his power. "Mrs. Morrison, did Millfield seem agitated or nervous when he was here?" "Very much so, Sheriff. He kept checking his pocket watch and looking up and down the street like he was expecting someone, and his hands were shaking something fierce." Tom realized that Millfield must have seen them leaving town for the ranch and decided this was his opportunity to gain control of Clara before the investigation could expose his involvement in Jed's murder. The bank was closed for the day, its windows dark and the front door locked, but Tom could see lamplight in Millfield's office window on the second floor. He motioned for Billy to circle around to the back entrance while he approached from the front. The front door yielded to Tom's shoulder after 2 hard pushes, the lock giving way with a splintering of wood. He drew his gun and moved carefully through the darkened main floor of the bank, listening for voices from upstairs. He could hear Millfield talking, his voice strained and urgent. "You have to understand, Margaret, I'm only trying to protect Clara's interests. A child can't manage such a substantial inheritance. She needs someone with financial experience." Margaret's voice carried clearly down the stairs, sharp with anger. "Mr. Millfield, you have no legal authority over Clara or her inheritance. I'm her aunt, and I'll be her guardian." "That can be arranged," Millfield replied, and Tom heard something ominous in the banker's tone. "Legal guardianship can be transferred when circumstances warrant it." Tom started up the stairs, moving as quietly as possible on the old wooden steps. Through the partially open office door, he could see Millfield pacing behind his desk, gesturing with what appeared to be a legal document. Margaret sat in a chair facing him, with Clara beside her clutching her teddy bear. "The thing is," Millfield continued, his voice taking on a desperate quality, "certain irregularities have come to light regarding Jed's financial affairs. The bank may need to seize his assets to cover outstanding debts, unless proper arrangements are made." Tom realized that Millfield was trying to coerce Margaret into signing over guardianship by threatening to take Clara's inheritance through fraudulent debt claims. It was the same kind of manipulation he might have used on Jed, pressure that had escalated into violence when the rancher refused to cooperate. "Mr. Millfield," Margaret said firmly, "I know what you're trying to do, and it won't work. Clara's inheritance has nothing to do with her father's debts, and you know it." Millfield stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think you're misunderstanding the gravity of the situation. Sometimes accidents happen to people who don't cooperate with necessary legal procedures." The threat was unmistakable now, and Tom knew he had to act. He pushed the office door open and stepped into the room, his gun trained on Millfield. "That's enough, Thomas. Step away from them." Millfield spun around, his face going white when he saw Tom's weapon. "Sheriff, this is just a business meeting. There's no need for what? For the same kind of accident that happened to Jed Hartwell." The accusation hung in the air, and Tom saw the moment when Millfield realized his scheme was collapsing. The banker's hand moved toward the desk drawer, but Tom's voice stopped him. "Don't make this worse than it already is. We found the inheritance documents, Thomas. We know about your correspondence with the Eastern lawyers, and we know you killed Jed when he wouldn't let you control Clara's money." Millfield's shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him. "You don't understand, Sheriff. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was just trying to protect the bank's interests by murdering a man and terrorizing his child." Clara had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now she looked up at Millfield with recognition dawning in her young eyes. "You're the bad man," she said quietly. "You killed my daddy." Millfield's face crumpled as he realized that his carefully constructed plan had unraveled completely. The little girl he'd tried to control would be the witness who ensured his conviction for murder. As Billy arrived to help with the arrest, Tom felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice would be served for Jed Hartwell, but it had come at a terrible price for a 10-year-old girl who had lost everything except the courage to speak the truth when it mattered most. The arrest of Thomas Millfield should have brought closure to the investigation, but that night, as Tom sat in his office reviewing the evidence, something continued to bother him. The banker's confession had been too easy, too convenient, and several pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit properly. Clara was staying with Margaret at the hotel, finally safe, but still traumatized by the day's events. As Tom locked up for the night, he decided to check on them one more time before heading home. He found Margaret sitting by the window in their hotel room, watching Clara sleep. The little girl looked peaceful for the first time since her father's death, her worn teddy bear tucked securely in her arms. "How is she?" Tom asked quietly. "Better, I think. She seems relieved that the bad man is locked up." Margaret stood and moved away from the bed so they could talk without waking Clara. "Sheriff, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done." "Just doing my job," Tom replied. But something in Margaret's manner struck him as odd. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact. "Is something wrong, Margaret?" "No, nothing's wrong. I'm just tired, I suppose. It's been a difficult few days." Tom was about to leave when Clara stirred in her sleep and began talking. Sleep talking wasn't uncommon in children, especially those who had experienced trauma. But Clara's words made Tom freeze. "Don't hurt Aunt Margaret," Clara mumbled. "She was just helping you find the papers." Tom looked sharply at Margaret, whose face had gone pale. "What did she mean by that?" "She's just having a nightmare," Margaret said quickly. Children say all sorts of things when they're sleeping, but Clara continued talking in her sleep, her voice becoming clearer. "Aunt Margaret said Daddy was being stupid about the money. She said Uncle Thomas needed it more than us." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. Uncle Thomas? Clara was referring to Thomas Millfield as her uncle, which meant Margaret knew him much better than she'd admitted. "Margaret," Tom said slowly. "How long have you known Thomas Millfield?" Margaret's composure cracked completely. "Sheriff, I can explain." "Start explaining now." Margaret sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "Thomas is my brother-in-law. My sister married him 5 years ago. When I learned about Clara's inheritance, I thought it would solve everyone's problems. The truth began pouring out. Of Margaret in a desperate rush. She'd been the one to tell Millfield about Clara's inheritance after finding some of Sarah's old letters when she was helping clear out her own mother's house. Millfield was deeply in debt due to bad investments and embezzlement from the bank, and the inheritance seemed like salvation. "But we never meant for Jed to die," Margaret insisted. "Thomas was supposed to convince him to sign guardianship papers. Nothing more. What went wrong?" Jed figured out what we were planning. He found Thomas searching the house for the inheritance documents and confronted him. They fought and... Margaret's voice broke. Thomas said it was an accident, that he only hit Jed once, but he kept hitting him. Tom felt sick as he realized the full scope of the conspiracy. And Clara saw it all. She was supposed to be asleep. We had no idea she was hiding in the barn until she ran into town, screaming about sleeping with pigs. The picture was becoming clear now. Margaret had lied about being summoned from the county seat. She'd already been in Cedar Ridge, helping Millfield plan the theft of Clara's inheritance. The elaborate frame-up of Marcus Wade had been designed to throw suspicion away from both of them. Whose idea was it to plant the watch? Tom asked. Thomas had found it months ago when Marcus dropped it while visiting the bank. He thought it would be perfect evidence to point toward Marcus if anyone became suspicious. Tom thought about Clara's innocent sleep talk and realized the child might have overheard more conversations than anyone suspected. Children often process trauma by talking to their toys, and Clara's bear might have been the repository for secrets too dangerous for her conscious mind to hold. "Margaret, Clara trusted you. She came to you for comfort after losing her father, and you were planning to steal her inheritance all along." "You don't understand," Margaret said desperately. "That money would have been wasted on a child. Thomas could have invested it, made it grow, provided for Clara's future properly. By murdering her father and traumatizing her for life?" Margaret had no answer for that. Tom realized that greed had twisted her thinking so completely that she'd convinced herself that betraying her own niece was somehow in the child's best interest. The sound of Clara stirring in her sleep drew their attention back to the bed. The little girl was talking again, but this time her words were even more damning. Aunt Margaret gave Uncle Thomas the key to Daddy's house. She said Daddy would be working late in the barn. Tom looked at Margaret with disgust. "You set him up. You told Millfield exactly when and where to find Jed. Thomas said he would just take the papers and leave. No one was supposed to get hurt." But Tom knew better. A man desperate enough to embezzle from his own bank and conspire to steal a child's inheritance wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses when his plan went wrong. What was supposed to happen to Clara after you got control of her money? Margaret's silence was answer enough. Tom realized that Clara's life had been in danger from the moment her inheritance became known. With Jed dead and herself as Clara's guardian, Margaret would have had years to gradually drain the inheritance while maintaining the pretense of caring for the child. Clara's sleep-talking had revealed the final piece of the puzzle: a conspiracy between family members who had seen a traumatized child not as a victim to be protected, but as an obstacle to wealth they felt entitled to claim. "Sheriff," Margaret whispered, "what's going to happen to Clara now? She'll be placed with people who actually care about her welfare, not her bank account." As Tom prepared to arrest Margaret, Clara woke up and saw him standing over her aunt. The little girl's eyes went wide with understanding, as if the conversation she'd overheard in her sleep had finally made sense to her conscious mind. "Aunt Margaret helped the bad man hurt Daddy," Clara said, her voice small but clear. Margaret started to deny it, but Clara continued with the devastating honesty of a child who had finally understood the betrayal that surrounded her. "I heard you talking to Uncle Thomas about the money. You said Daddy was too stupid to know what was good for him." Clara clutched her teddy bear tighter. "You said I would be better off without him." The words hung in the hotel room like an indictment. Margaret had gambled that a traumatized child wouldn't remember or understand the conversations she'd overheard, but Clara's sharp young mind had been processing everything, storing it away until she felt safe enough to reveal the truth. As Tom led Margaret away in handcuffs, he realized that Clara's ordeal was finally over. The real conspirators had been exposed, and the brave little girl who had survived her father's murder would inherit not just money, but justice for the man who had loved and protected her. But the cost had been enormous. Clara had lost not just her father, but the aunt she'd trusted to care for her. The inheritance that should have secured her future had instead brought tragedy and betrayal that would take years to heal. Tom looked back at Clara, who was sitting alone in the hotel room with only her teddy bear for comfort. Tomorrow, he would help find her a real home with people who would value her for herself, not for the fortune that had already cost her so much. The case was closed, but Tom knew that for Clara, the real work of healing was just beginning. The morning after Margaret's arrest brought unexpected complications that threatened to unravel everything Tom thought he'd solved. Dr. Henderson arrived at the sheriff's office with disturbing news about his re-examination of Thomas Millfield, who had spent the night in the town's small jail. "Sheriff, I don't think Millfield killed Jed Hartwell," Doc said without preamble. Tom looked up from the paperwork he'd been completing. "What do you mean? He confessed yesterday." "That's just it. I've been thinking about his confession all night, and it doesn't match the evidence." Doc sat down heavily in the chair across from Tom's desk. "Millfield claimed he hit Jed once in a moment of panic, but the autopsy showed 3 distinct blows from different angles. That's not panic. That's deliberate, methodical killing." Tom felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Maybe he was lying about the details to make it sound less premeditated. Maybe, but there's something else. Millfield's hands don't show any signs of recent violence, no bruises, cuts, or abrasions. "Jed fought hard before he died, Sheriff. His killer should have defensive wounds." The implications of Doc's observations were troubling. Tom had been so focused on the inheritance motive and the conspiracy between Margaret and Millfield that he might have missed the real killer entirely. "Doc, are you saying Millfield is innocent?" "I'm saying his confession doesn't match the physical evidence. Someone else delivered those killing blows." Tom's mind raced through the possibilities. If Millfield hadn't actually killed Jed, then who had? And why would the banker confess to a murder he didn't commit? The answer came when Tom returned to the jail to question Millfield more thoroughly. The banker was sitting on his cot, staring at his hands, with an expression of profound guilt and fear. "Thomas, I need you to tell me exactly what happened the night Jed died." Millfield looked up with haunted eyes. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about what I said yesterday. I was so panicked, so desperate to end this nightmare." "Are you saying you lied about killing Jed?" "No, Millfield's voice broke. "I was there, Sheriff. I went to the ranch that night to get those papers. But when I found Jed in the barn, he was already fighting with someone else." Tom leaned forward intently. "Who was he fighting with?" "I couldn't see clearly in the dark. It was a big man, bigger than me. When I heard Jed cry out, I should have helped him, but I was afraid. I hid like a coward and watched a good man die." "What happened after Jed was killed?" "The killer covered up the body, then searched the barn and the house. I waited until he left, then Millfield's shame was palpable. "I took advantage of the situation. I searched for the inheritance papers myself." Tom felt pieces of the puzzle shifting again. "Thomas, why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" "Because I thought if I confessed to the murder, you'd stop looking for the real killer. I was terrified that if you kept investigating, you'd discover my connection to Margaret and the embezzlement at the bank." The banker's confession of cowardice, rather than murder, cast the entire case in a new light. Someone else had killed Jed. Hartwell, someone who remained free while Millfield and Margaret took the blame for their conspiracy to steal Clara's inheritance. Tom returned to his office to find Clara waiting with Widow Morrison, who had volunteered to care for the child until permanent arrangements could be made. Clara looked small and lost in the adult-sized chair, but her eyes showed an alertness that suggested she was processing everything happening around her. "Clara," Tom said gently, I need to ask you some more questions about that night. I know. It's difficult, but it's very important. Clara nodded solemnly. Is Uncle Thomas really the bad man who hurt Daddy? Tom realized he couldn't lie to the child, not after she'd been betrayed by so many adults already. Clara, Uncle Thomas did bad things, but I don't think he's the one who hurt your daddy. I think someone else did that. Clara's grip tightened on her teddy bear. There were two bad men. I think so, honey. Can you remember anything about the first bad man, the one who actually fought with your daddy? Clara closed her eyes, and Tom could see her struggling to recall details from that terrible night. He was bigger than Uncle Thomas, and he made scary noises when he breathed, like he was sick. Scary breathing noises, like when Daddy had the lung fever last winter, wheezy and loud. This was a new detail that could prove crucial in identifying the real killer. Tom made notes while encouraging Clara to continue. Was there anything else different about the first bad man? He smelled different too. Not like Daddy's medicine, more like the blacksmith shop. The smell of the blacksmith shop meant metal and coal smoke, odors that would cling to someone who worked around forges and anvils. Tom's mind immediately went to Samuel Cross, Marcus Wade's foreman, but Cross had been accounted for during the time of the murder. Clara, after the first bad man left, how long was it before Uncle Thomas came to the barn? A long time. I was getting very cold hiding with the pigs. Tom realized that there had been a significant gap between the murder and Millfield's arrival. At the ranch, long enough for the real killer to complete his search and leave the area before the banker arrived to conduct his own futile hunt for the inheritance papers. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Tom saw Marcus Wade dismounting in front of the office. The rancher's face was grim as he entered, his usual composure replaced by obvious agitation. "Sheriff, I need to talk to you about Samuel Cross." Tom's attention sharpened. Immediately. What about him? He's missing. Didn't show up for work this morning and his bunk is empty. Some of the other men say he's been acting strange the past few days, drinking more than usual and talking about leaving the territory. The timing of Cross's disappearance was too convenient to be coincidental. Tom realized that the foreman might have had his own reasons for wanting Jed dead, reasons that had nothing to do with land disputes or inheritance schemes. "Marcus, tell me everything you know about Cross's background." Wade settled into a chair, his expression troubled. "I hired him 8 years ago when he drifted through looking for work. He had references from ranches in Texas, said he was running from bad memories after his family died in a cholera outbreak. Any criminal history? Not that I knew of, but..." Wade hesitated. Some of the men mentioned that Cross had been asking questions about the Hartwell ranch lately. Wanted to know about Jed's financial situation, whether he owed money to anyone. Tom felt the investigation taking another sharp turn. If Cross had learned about Clara's inheritance through his own inquiries, he might have decided to eliminate Jed and claim guardianship of the child himself. "Marcus, does Cross have any health problems? Breathing difficulties?" Wade nodded grimly. "Lung damage from working in mines before he became a cowboy. He wheezes when he exerts himself, especially in cold weather." The pieces were finally coming together. Samuel Cross had the physical characteristics Clara remembered, the motive of greed, and the opportunity to commit murder while using his position at the Wade Ranch as cover. "Sheriff," Clara said quietly, "the first bad man. I remember something else about him." Tom knelt down to Clara's level. "What do you remember, sweetheart?" He had a hurt hand. He kept shaking it like it was painful. Wade's face went white. "Cross injured his hand 2 weeks ago when a horse stepped on it. He's been favoring it ever since." Tom realized that Samuel Cross was their killer, and he was now running with a substantial head start. The foreman knew the territory well and had connections throughout the region that could help him disappear completely. "Marcus, I need you to gather some of your men. We're going after Cross, and we need to move fast." As preparations began for the pursuit, Tom looked back at Clara, who was watching everything with the solemn attention of a child who had already seen too much violence. "Don't worry, honey," he promised. "We're going to catch the real bad man this time." But Tom knew that. Apprehending Samuel Cross wouldn't be easy. The foreman was desperate, dangerous, and running for his life. The chase that was about to begin would determine whether justice would finally be served for Jed Hartwell's murder. Clara's courage in providing the crucial details about her father's killer had given them the break they needed. Now it was up to Tom and his posse to ensure that her bravery wasn't wasted. The hunt for Samuel Cross was about to begin, and Tom knew it would be the most dangerous pursuit of his career. The trail of Samuel Cross led north through rugged country, where a man could lose himself among the canyons and dense pine forests. Tom rode with a posse of 6 men, including Marcus Wade and Billy Watson, following tracks that were already ours. The urgency of their pursuit was driven by more than just justice for Jed Hartwell. Cross knew that Clara could identify him, and a desperate man might return to eliminate the only witness who could link him to murder. "Sheriff," Billy called, out, pointing to fresh horse droppings on the trail. "He's pushing his mount hard. Can't be more than an hour ahead of us now." Tom studied the tracks in the soft earth, noting how the hoofprints showed the irregular gait of a tired horse being driven beyond its endurance. Cross was making mistakes born of panic, following obvious paths instead of taking the harder routes that would conceal his passage. Marcus Wade rode up beside Tom, his face grim with the responsibility of having employed a killer. "Sheriff, there's something else you need to know about Cross. He's not just running from the law, he's running from debts." "What kind of debts?" "Gambling debts to some very dangerous men. Word came through last week that they were looking for him. I think that's why he's been so desperate lately." The picture became clearer. Cross hadn't just killed for Clara's inheritance. He'd killed because he needed money quickly to save his own life. A man facing death from creditors might view murdering a rancher and stealing a child's fortune as his only way out. The trail led them higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and cold clouds gathered around the peaks. Tom could feel his horse laboring as they climbed, and he knew Cross's mount would be suffering even more from the relentless pace. They found the first sign of their quarry's desperation when Billy discovered an abandoned campsite beside a small stream. The fire was still warm, and scattered supplies suggested that Cross had left in a hurry. "Looks like he heard us coming," one of the posse members observed. Tom examined the camp more carefully. Cross had been preparing food when something spooked him, probably the sound of approaching horses echoing off the canyon walls. But more importantly, Tom found evidence that the killer was no longer just running. He was preparing to fight. Cartridge boxes had been opened and ammunition sorted. A rifle had been cleaned and loaded. Cross had chosen this high ground deliberately, turning their pursuit into a potential ambush. "Everyone spread out," Tom ordered quietly. "He's up there somewhere, and he's armed." The posse moved cautiously up the narrow canyon, using boulders and trees for cover. Tom could feel the weight of responsibility for the men who had volunteered to help him catch a killer. These were good men with families, not professional lawmen, and he wouldn't let them walk into a trap. The shot came from a ridge about 200 yards ahead, the bullet whining off a rock near Billy's position. Cross had the high ground and a good rifle, advantages that could turn the pursuit into a siege. "Cross," Tom shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You're surrounded. Give yourself up." The response was another rifle shot that came closer to its target. Cross wasn't interested in surrender. He was fighting for his life, knowing that capture meant hanging for murder. Tom studied the terrain, looking for a way to outflank the killer's position. The ridge where Cross had taken cover was accessible from the east, but it would mean a dangerous climb through open ground where a good marksman could pick off anyone attempting the approach. "Sheriff," Marcus Wade said quietly, "there's an old mining trail that leads around behind that ridge. It's treacherous, but it might get us above him." Tom weighed the options. A frontal assault would cost lives, but the mining trail was risky in its own way. One slip on the narrow ledges could mean a fatal fall into the canyon below. "Marcus, Take 2 men and try the mining trail. Billy, you and the others keep Cross busy from down here. Make him think we're all still in the canyon." As the group split up, Tom found himself thinking about Clara, safe in town, but still traumatized by all she had witnessed. The little girl had shown incredible courage in providing the details that led them to Cross, and Tom was determined that her bravery would not be wasted. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon as Billy's group exchanged shots with Cross, keeping the killer's attention focused downward while Tom's flanking party attempted the treacherous climb. Every step up the mining trail was a gamble, the old path crumbling under their weight and threatening to send them tumbling into the abyss. But Tom knew this was their best chance to end the pursuit before Cross escaped into the vast wilderness beyond the ridge. The final confrontation was approaching, and Tom prayed that justice for Jed Hartwell would finally be within reach. The mining trail proved even more treacherous than Marcus had warned. Ancient wooden supports had rotted away, leaving gaps where one wrong step meant certain death. Tom led the way, testing each foothold before trusting his weight to the crumbling path behind him. Marcus Wade and the 3rd posse member followed with grim determination. All 3 men understood that this dangerous climb might be their only chance to capture Samuel Cross without a prolonged gunfight that could cost innocent lives. From below, the sound of intermittent gunfire told Tom that Billy was doing his job, keeping Cross focused on the canyon floor while the flanking party worked their way around to higher ground. The killer's position was strong, but it had one fatal weakness: he couldn't watch all directions at once. As they climbed higher, Tom began to hear something that made his blood run cold. Between the rifle shots, Cross was shouting, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "I know you can hear me, Sheriff," Cross yelled. "That little girl saw too much. When I'm done with you, I'm going back for her." The threat against Clara filled Tom with cold fury. It confirmed what he'd feared, that Cross wouldn't consider himself safe as long as the child could identify him. The killer was planning to return to Cedar Ridge to eliminate the only witness to his crime. "He's desperate," Marcus whispered, as they paused to rest on a narrow ledge. "Men like that don't give up easy." Tom nodded grimly. Cross had nothing left to lose, which made him exponentially more dangerous. A cornered animal would fight to the death, and Cross was exactly that, a predator backed into his final refuge. The old mining trail finally brought them to a position above Cross's rocky stronghold. Tom could see the killer about 50 feet below, positioned behind a boulder that provided excellent cover from the canyon floor, but left him exposed from above. Cross was a big man, as Clara had described, with the weathered face and powerful build of someone who had spent his life doing hard physical labor. His breathing was labored from exertion and altitude, producing the wheezing sound that had frightened a little girl hiding among the pigs. Tom drew his revolver and took careful aim. "Samuel Cross, drop your weapon and surrender!" Cross spun around, his rifle swinging toward Tom's position. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across 50 feet of rocky terrain, the lawman seeking justice and the killer fighting for his life. "You don't understand, Sheriff," Cross shouted, his rifle still trained upward. "I didn't mean to kill Hartwell. I just wanted the papers." "Tell it to a judge, Samuel. Put down the rifle." "Can't do that. Those gambling debts, they'll kill me. If I don't pay up, the girl's inheritance was my only chance." Tom could see the desperation in Cross's eyes, the look of a man who had convinced himself that murder was justified by his circumstances. It was a familiar sight to anyone who had dealt with killers, the ability to rationalize any action when survival was at stake. "What about Clara, Samuel? What about what you put that little girl through?" For a moment, something flickered across Cross's face, shame, perhaps, or regret. But it was quickly replaced by the hard resolve of a man who had already committed to his course. "She shouldn't have been there," Cross said flatly. "None of this would have happened if she'd stayed in the house like she was supposed to." The callousness of blaming a child for witnessing her father's murder removed any sympathy Tom might have felt for Cross's situation. Some men could be redeemed, but others were simply too far gone. Last chance, Samuel. Drop the rifle. Cross's answer came in the form of a muzzle flash as he fired upward, the bullet chipping rock near Tom's head. Tom returned fire, his shot taking Cross in the shoulder and spinning him around. The wounded killer stumbled, but didn't fall, bringing his rifle up for another shot. Marcus Wade fired from Tom's left, his bullet catching Cross center mass and dropping him to his knees. Cross tried to raise his rifle one more time, but his strength was fading fast. The weapon slipped from his hands and clattered onto the rocks as he toppled forward. Tom and Marcus made their way carefully down to where Cross lay dying. The killer's breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle that produced the wheezing sound Clara had described so accurately. "Samuel," Tom said quietly, kneeling beside him, "do you have anything to say about what you did to Jed Hartwell?" Cross's eyes found Tom's face, and for a moment the killer's expression softened. "Tell the girl, tell her I'm sorry. Her daddy was a good man, I never meant—" The words were cut off as Cross exhaled for the final time, his body going still on the rocky ground where his desperate flight had ended. Tom looked down at the man, who had brought so much pain to a little girl, and felt no satisfaction in the outcome. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back Jed Hartwell or erase the trauma Clara would carry for the rest of her life. The ride back to Cedar Ridge was solemn, Cross's body wrapped and tied across his horse. The posse had accomplished what they'd set out to do, but victory felt hollow when measured against the cost in human suffering. As they descended from the mountains, Tom found himself thinking about Clara's courage throughout the ordeal. A 10-year-old child had endured the murder of her father, betrayal by family members, and the terror of knowing a killer wanted her dead. Yet she had found the strength to provide the crucial testimony that led to Cross's capture. "Sheriff," Marcus Wade said as they neared town, "what happens to the girl now?" Tom had been wrestling with that question throughout their pursuit. Clara's inheritance would ensure her financial security, but money couldn't replace the family she'd lost, or heal the wounds that would take years to mend. "Doc Henderson and his wife have been talking about taking her in," Tom replied. "They're good people, and they've always wanted children of their own." The sun was setting as they rode into Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Tom of better times when the town's biggest worries involved cattle prices and weather patterns. The violence of recent days seemed almost impossible in such peaceful surroundings. Word of their return spread quickly, and townspeople gathered in the street to hear the news. Tom dismounted in front of his office, feeling the weight of their expectations and hoping he could provide the closure they all needed. "Samuel Cross is dead," he announced simply. "He won't be hurting anyone else." The crowd stirred with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Justice in frontier towns was often rough and final, and most folks felt that a killer's death was fitting payment for murder. Tom made his way to the hotel where Clara was staying with Widow Morrison. He found the little girl sitting by the window, still clutching her teddy bear, watching the sunset paint the mountains in golden light. "Clara," Tom said gently, "it's over. The bad man who hurt your daddy won't hurt anyone else." Clara looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her. "Yes. Is he dead?" Tom nodded. "Yes, honey, he is." Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing this news with the solemnity of a child who had learned too much about death. "Did he say anything about Daddy?" Tom knelt down beside her chair. "He said he was sorry, Clara. He said your daddy was a good man." Tears began to flow down Clara's cheeks, not the hysterical crying of trauma, but the quiet tears of a child beginning to grieve properly for the first time since her father's death. "I miss Daddy," she whispered. "I know you do, sweetheart. That's normal and it's okay." Tom stayed with Clara until she fell asleep, her teddy bear tucked securely in her arms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal proceedings, arrangements for her care, decisions about her inheritance. But tonight, for the first time since her world had been shattered, Clara could sleep without fear. The case that had begun with a little girl's desperate cries in the street was finally closed. Justice served through the courage of a child who had faced unimaginable loss and still found the strength to speak the truth. 6 months had passed since the night Clara Hartwell ran through the streets of Cedar Ridge, crying about her father and sleeping with pigs. The seasons had changed from the crisp autumn of tragedy to the gentle warmth of spring renewal, and with that change had come healing for both the little girl and the town that had rallied around her. Sheriff Tom Avery stood on the front porch of Doc Henderson's house, watching Clara play in the garden with her new teddy bear, a gift from the women of Cedar Ridge who had wanted to replace the worn toy that held too many painful memories. The new bear was bright brown, with amber button eyes, and Clara had named him Hope. Doc Henderson and his wife Mary had officially adopted Clara after the legal proceedings concluded. Thomas Millfield and Margaret Hartwell had been sentenced to prison for their conspiracy, though their sentences were lighter than they might have been due to Millfield's cooperation in the investigation. Marcus Wade had been completely exonerated, and the silver pocket watch that had caused so much confusion was returned to him with the town's apologies. "She's doing much better," Mary Henderson said, joining Tom on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Still has nightmares sometimes, but they're getting less frequent." Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, his eyes never leaving Clara as she carefully tended the small vegetable garden Doc had helped her plant. The child had shown remarkable resilience, though Tom knew the scars from her ordeal would never completely fade. "Any word from the Eastern lawyers about her inheritance?" Tom asked. "Everything's been arranged properly this time," Mary replied. "The money will be held in trust until she turns 21, with Doc and me as trustees. Clara will never want for anything, but she'll also learn the value of work and responsibility." Tom nodded approvingly. One of his greatest fears had been that Clara's wealth might attract more people who saw her as an opportunity rather than a child who needed love and stability. Clara looked up from her garden and waved at Tom, her smile genuine for the first time since he'd known her. The bright, chattering little girl her neighbors remembered was slowly returning, though she would always carry a deeper understanding of life's complexities than most children her age. "Sheriff Tom!" Clara called out, running over to the porch. "Look what's growing!" She proudly displayed a handful of tiny green shoots that were just beginning to emerge from the dark soil. Her enthusiasm for this small miracle of growth touched Tom's heart and reminded him why he'd become a lawman in the first place: to protect the innocent and ensure that life could flourish even after tragedy. "Those look like they're going to be fine vegetables, Clara," Tom said solemnly. "You're taking good care of them. Doc says if you plant things with love and take care of them every day, they grow strong and healthy," Clara replied. "Just like people." The wisdom in her simple statement struck Tom as profound. Clara had been replanted in loving soil after the violence that had uprooted her previous life, and she was indeed growing strong and healthy under the careful tending of her new family. Doc Henderson emerged from the house, medical bag in hand for his afternoon rounds. He paused to ruffle Clara's hair affectionately, a gesture that the child accepted with the easy trust she'd learned to feel for her adoptive father. "Tom, glad you stopped by," Doc said. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you did for our family." "Our family." Tom noted how naturally Doc included Clara in that phrase. The adoption had been more than legal paperwork. It had been a genuine joining of hearts that had given Clara the security she needed to heal. "Just doing my job, Doc," Tom replied, though they both knew it had been much more than that. As Tom prepared to leave, Clara tugged on his sleeve. "Sheriff Tom, I have something for you." She ran into the house and returned with a small drawing she'd made, a picture of a man in a sheriff's badge standing next to a little girl and her teddy bear. At the bottom, in careful childish letters, she'd written, "Thank you for keeping me safe." Tom felt his throat tighten as he accepted the drawing. In all his years of law enforcement, he'd received commendations and awards, but nothing had ever meant as much as this simple expression of gratitude from a child whose life he'd helped save. "I'll treasure this, Clara," he said quietly. "Will you come visit me again?" she asked. "As often as I can," Tom promised. "And when you're older, maybe you can help me solve mysteries." Clara's eyes lit up at the prospect. "Really? Could I be a deputy sheriff someday?" "If that's what you want to be, I don't see why not. You're already pretty good at noticing important details." As Tom rode back toward town, the drawing carefully tucked in his vest pocket, he reflected on how the case had changed him. He'd seen the worst of human nature in the greed and betrayal that had destroyed Clara's original family. But he'd also witnessed the best in the community's response to a child in need. The Hartwell ranch had been sold, with the proceeds added to Clara's trust fund. A new family had moved in, bringing life and laughter back to the land where tragedy had once reigned. The barn had been torn down and rebuilt, erasing the physical reminders of violence while preserving the good memories of honest work and family life. Cedar Ridge had returned to its peaceful rhythms, but Tom knew the town had been changed by recent events. People looked out for each other more carefully now, understanding that evil could wear familiar faces and that protecting the innocent required constant vigilance. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and purple, Tom thought about Clara's garden and the lesson it contained. Even after the darkest events, new growth was possible with patience, care, and love. Clara Hartwell had lost everything that terrible night when she ran crying through the streets, but she had also found something precious, a community that refused to let evil triumph, and a family that would love her, not for her inheritance, but for the brave, resilient person she was becoming. The little girl who had once cried, "Daddy said sleep in the barn with pigs," was now safely tucked into a loving home, her future bright with possibility. And in his office, Sheriff Tom Avery kept her drawing, pinned to the wall as a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest cases, justice and healing were possible.